Hello. Thanks. Wow, thanks.
Welcome. I think you're at 100 weeks at #1 on the Times bestseller.
Well, I wasn't #1 the whole time, but we did.
You still apparently draw a crowd, so this is good. Thank you for being here. I feel really privileged to be able to put some questions to you. I wanted to dive in just with a meta question, but in the past year and a half or so, you've been thrust into this position of kind of explaining America to us and to become an explainer of the gulf that has opened up between, the tribes in this country. I guess I'm wondering, did you want this role? Do you want this role?
No, I would rather that someone else were doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Ideally, we'd all be doing it. And ideally, I think part of what it would mean to be politically engaged would be trying to understand the other side and understand what kind of arguments might be compelling to the other side. And that would ideally be a part of what political engagement means and looks like. But it doesn't seem to be how we're defining it so much lately. Not really. So, I don't know. I have the way that I think it's helpful to talk about what's going on and what our disagreements are, and I push that forward. But I wish there were more people doing it my way, because I narcissistically think I'm right.
You said something not too long ago about, you spoke about a loss of charity as sort of being behind our inability to find common ground with others. I'm wondering, sort of in this vein, what has been like the most annoying or tin-eared question that you've gotten at events like this? I want to make sure I cross it off my list in case it's that reflects a kind of, I guess, lack of understanding of the other side. If that makes sense.
I don't know if I can give you a specific question. I guess the book I wrote is not actually meant to be it's not a political book. It's not about the left or the right. It's not about Trump or not Trump. It's got nothing to do with 2020 in a direct way. I think in as much as it's about politics at all, it's only because the setting is rural Idaho. Mm-hmm. And we don't hear a lot about rural Idaho. And you don't get a lot of people from rural Idaho at festivals like this one, and you don't get a lot of people articulating that way of life. But the book, it's, the story, the story that I wrote, is not about politics. And in as much as I'm really pleased that the book's been on the New York Times list for 100 weeks, it's because it's one of the few nonfiction books that isn't about politics. If you look at the list this last week, someone told me that the book that came on at #1 and #2, one of them is, super anti-Trump, and the other one is super pro-Trump. And for a lot of the last 2 years, that's what the nonfiction list has looked like. Mm-hmm. It's been made up half of books that are, can you believe how awful Trump is? And the other half of the books that are, can you believe how wonderful Trump is? And I worry about a society where in the place of storytelling we get polemics. Like I worry about just the health of a society where the storytelling gets replaced by political books. And so I very much want my book to stay a story. And in as much as it has political implications at all, it's just in trying to collapse some of that space. And for people who read it who maybe don't know anything about that part of the world or what that life would be like or why people think the way they do, that they could see we're not that different, actually. I mean, the things that people in Idaho worry about, they worry about how their kids are doing, they worry about how their parents' health is, they worry about a lot of the same things that you'd worry about anywhere. We're not that different.
Into the book, you write that you quote your dad saying, "I may as well surrender my kids to the devil himself as send them down the road to that school." He's ordering rifles.
He wasn't totally representative of Idaho. I think we should.
No, I think
we should also clarify.
Yes, we can.
Very much an individual in his own right.
He's ordering rifles. He's sort of prepping for doomsday. He's got you packing a kind of go bag to get ready to run up the mountain in case the feds or the Illuminati came. You wrote that it wasn't until he turned 30 that he pulled your brothers out of school, and that he got rid of telephone, didn't renew his driver's license, and it all seemed to kind of go south from there. What I wasn't clear on was Ruby Ridge, when he turned 30, was that the turning point? Was it? I'm trying to understand what happened here. What?
I don't think that was the turning. I think it was a turning point. And you have to remember too, I wasn't there because I'm the youngest of my parents' 7 kids. So I'm trying to stitch together the story without having witnessed it. And so I look at, okay, when did the boys leave school? Tyler went to 1st grade, so that's roughly the time. And after that, he didn't go, and Luke never went. That was my 4th brother. So I'm kind of trying to stitch it together. I think it was gradual. It was, he started to have these ideas. And over a period of a few years, he pulled all the kids out of school, and then we stopped getting birth certificates. We were all born at home. It was a gradual thing. Ruby Ridge came, I think that was 1992. So that would have been a little bit later in the process. He would have been 40. And I think it kind of solidified some of the ideas that he had about what the government was like and about what the risks were. But the way that I grew up thinking about Ruby Ridge was as this kind of massive cover-up, that this government had behaved really terribly. Callous disregard for human life was a phrase that I would read later, and that no one knew about it. I'm not sure how I thought that we knew about it, but I thought nobody knew about it, just us. And it really wasn't until I got to college, and I took a psychology class actually, and the professor was talking about Ruby Ridge, and I went and read about it, and that required a lot of nuance, because I think when you look at the facts of Ruby Ridge, the government did behave in a pretty shocking way. I mean, I can't think of any justification for shooting an unarmed woman holding a baby. Like, I just can't defend that. But the other side of it is that there were inquiries, there were investigations. Congress investigated. There were divisions of the government that investigated. It was all over the news. And so, in a way, it had happened remarkably similarly to the way that my dad described it to me. And yet, as I got older, that older version that I learned was just very, very different. And it did seem to be a little bit of a democracy springing into action to correct something that needed correcting.
Just on that point, and I don't know if I'm just viewing this through I'm working on a book that deals with the white supremacist movement now, but I mean, the Weavers, I think the original charge was selling an illegal gun to someone in Aryan nations, and a lot of the apocalyptic language and stockpiling and prepping, and of course, Aryan nations were headquartered in Idaho. I guess I was wondering while I was reading, I mean, you touch on your brother's sort of casual use of the N-word. I was wondering, was this all just sort of unique to your family? Was there any sort of adjacency to white supremacists? I just feel like I'm asking a loaded question, but there's just a lot of like sort of corollaries between these two, between the behavior of your family and what was happening elsewhere in the state.
Yeah, northern Idaho has a pretty serious problem with white supremacist groups, actually. There's official organizations. I was raised in southern Idaho, so my family never attended any meetings like that. The kind of meetings that the Weavers would have been going to, we never attended anything like that. I suspect my dad was reading some of the same things that Randy Weaver was reading. There was, the same kind of things by mail, listening to the same radio. I suspect there was some overlap there. But no, my family was not officially involved in anything like that. What to say about... Okay. Remedial microphoning. My family, race in my family was something we never talked about.
explicitly that I remember. And I knew about slavery, I was taught about slavery, but I was never taught anything about how slavery ended, civil rights movement, all of that was just kind of skipped over for me. And I think one of the things that's just surprised me over the last couple of years is learning that I thought that I got that particular version of history because I was raised by survivalists and never went to school. But then you kind of realize that actually a lot of people grow up and get an education in this country and never really learn those stories, or are never engaging with those stories. So the experience I had, I think of as being really unusual, but I'm not always sure how unusual it is. So what happened to me is I never learned anything about it, and then I went to college when I was 17 and wound up in a course on American history, having never been in a classroom before, which is not something I really recommend doing if any of you wanted to try it. And the professor starts talking about this thing called the civil rights movement, and I had no idea what that was. And he puts up this picture of Rosa Parks, and he explains that she has been arrested for taking a seat on a bus. And I understood him as saying that she had been arrested for stealing the bus seat. It's like kind of an unfortunate misunderstanding between to take a seat versus to take that seat. But, in my mind, without that understanding of history, without having learned much about it, it made a lot more sense to me to think that she would have been arrested for stealing the seat than for sitting in it. Mm-hmm. I didn't have that space in my head to think that there'd been a time in my country, in the living memory of my mother, who to me seems young, has always seemed young, that an American could be arrested for sitting down on a bus. It just doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense. And even as I sit here telling you the story, I tend to want to defend my version as making more sense than what turned out to be true. But to the point I guess I was trying to make is that I came to these stories without any knowledge of experiences of the United States that were different from mine and my family's and people who look like me. And I think to a pretty big degree, I think a lot of people have that same thing. We're all taught versions of history that are that come from the communities that we live in. And I think part of what education is that you get access to perspectives and points of view and stories that are not your story, that are not coming from the people who are like you, that are not put in front of you, but you're actively seeking other perspectives. And civil rights movement, learning about that was one of the most important things I ever learned about, because not only did I learn about something that was itself important, but I learned about the degree to which the reality that we live in is made for us by other people.
There was so much made of the detail that when you got to Brigham Young that you had never heard of the Holocaust. But I found an article the other day, 2018 Washington Post article, 2/3 of American millennials surveyed in a recent poll cannot identify what Auschwitz is, according to a study released on Holocaust Remembrance Day. 22% of millennials, let's not all gang up on millennials here, 22% of millennials in the poll said they hadn't heard of the Holocaust or aren't sure whether they've heard of it, twice the percentage of U.S. adults as a whole who said the same, which just made me, think that what failed you or what you were deprived of is not that isolated, I think, in our country.
It should be more. I mean, you would think that my experience would be the extreme, the unusual thing, and yet when you hear those statistics, I think that there is we're all stuck in our bubbles in a way, and we only hear about the things that are directly relevant to us. And when you're talking about a really tribal political situation, trying to have a conversation when you cannot agree even on the reality that you're living in is very, very hard.
You've written this intensely personal memoir about your family, about your dad, and I don't know if you're on the tail end of a sort of never-ending tour to discuss this book, but I'm wondering, over this past year of being asked presumably a lot of the same questions and being told to explain this story, if your thinking on it has hardened just through sort of brute repetition, have you had any sort of
Almost certainly. Yes, this is going to be a very boring interview, guys. Sorry. It's all downhill from here.
I teed that one up. That's not what I meant. I meant that, do you feel like you're able to interrogate the past with the same intensity that you did in the book?
Probably not. It's kind of an interesting, I don't really read the book or go near the book very often, but occasionally I have to because somebody asks me a question from it or I need to get some bit of information out of it. And what I'm always struck by when I do open it up and look at it is that it's kind of this artifact, the book. It's this, like, I wrote it on a Word document in a really dingy flat in London where it was like flooded on this computer that was broken, so the screen was permanently blue. And that was the product, and no one had read it, and no one had heard of it, and I didn't have an agent, I didn't have a publisher, and I wrote the whole thing. That's how it was written, and it is the same. Like the words on the page, those are the words. It's like a kind of weirdly preserved artifact from that time before anybody knew what it was, and so. I go out and I talk about it, and you go on TV, and sometimes the TV interviews are great, and sometimes they're really reductive, and it's kind of painful because you're thinking, my life it's a lot more complicated than that, and you've made it into a theme park. And so I can start feeling a little bit separate from it and a little weirded out by it. But the weird thing is that the book, because the words don't change, the book is just still this kind of weird artifact from this other time before. That was written very much by a person who didn't think anybody would read it, which was very comforting. It's a really comforting place to write a book from. It's strange. I'm sure that you're right, and that now it's weird to a story that you've told before. I do think it hardens a bit, and what you remember about it becomes changed by the fact that you retell it. I mean, this is what psychologists tell us. Every time you access a memory, you change that memory. And I'm sure that that's true. And what I'm struck by when I do pick up the book, which I don't do very much, is it's just like, oh yeah, this is just frozen in place where it started.
Could you walk me through? I know you said that you wrote it without envisioning an audience for it just yet, but I'm wondering what your deliberations were like in terms of where the line of privacy was, in terms of protecting your family, or when you knew you crossed it. How did you strike that balance?
I tried to think pretty hard about what do I actually need to tell, and if there was something that was just kind of I don't know, it'd be interesting or it would be sensational, but I didn't need to write about it. It wasn't important. The story could be fine without it. What I was trying to say could be fine without it. What I was trying to communicate would be fine without it. Then I just left those out. They're just, if it's not needed, it's not needed. But it's a complicated thing. I think the reality is if you're going to tell your story, you're also going to be telling the stories of other people. And I don't think it's a completely uncomplicated thing. It's and you have to kind of take some responsibility for it. And there's not a perfect solution. I did the best that I could, and I tried to document. Here are memories I have that are not like my family's memories, and I used footnotes for that. Or I sent the manuscript to 3 of my brothers and my aunts and uncles, and tried to get as much feedback as I could before I published it, to make sure that it was as accurate as I could make it, and that other points of view were represented. And then in the writing of it, I tried to be as empathetic as I could be. So even when people were doing things that were not totally flattering, I tried to understand what are the bigger reasons why this was happening. But I don't have a perfect answer to you. I don't think that you can write a memoir and say that it's not going to affect the people that you're writing about. I think you're probably deluding yourself if you think that that's true. And what you do is you try to tell your own story and handle other people's stories as lovingly as you can.
There are so many bodily injuries in this book, and
they're not OSHA approved.
To such a degree that, and I think I'd become acquainted enough with your writing style that when you set up the story of the shear, I was audibly saying, no, please don't go over there. Someone's gonna get maimed. But of all of the sort of infuriating aspects of these potentially preventable injuries that occurred because of, stubbornness or whatever from on your dad's side. What bothered me the most about all of this was when you had a couple throwaway lines where your parents were claiming credit for your own academic achievements. When you got into BYU, your dad said it proves one thing at least, that our homeschool is as good as any public education. You were very sort of charitable and kind, but did that rankle you as much as it should have?
At the time, I remember being really annoyed by it. Yeah, was really, really angry. And now I can't imagine. It is complicated. There's 3 of my siblings. There's 3 of my parents' 7 children that all have PhDs. I don't understand that. I talked to my brother Richard. Like, did you ever write an essay for mom? No. Did you ever take an exam for mom? No. Did mom ever get you into a room and teach you anything? No. And I'm like, well, then how did this come about? And I don't know. On the one hand, I kind of want to say, oh, well, they were terrible. They didn't teach us anything of value. Everything that we did, we deserved ourselves. We're just really wonderful. But statistically, 3 of their kids have PhDs. It's really weird. So I think 3 of us just seriously overcompensated from not being allowed to go to school. We just went to all the school. And then, 4 of my siblings never graduated from high school. So there's just a total bifurcation there. And it just a really real division. We've got to be the most educationally divided family ever. And so I don't know. I mean, I will never solve that puzzle of how much gratitude should I give them because they clearly taught me something that was useful, and how much do I just get to be angry all the time because I went to school and didn't know what the Holocaust was. I don't know. And it's a question that bothers me less and less. I guess as I get older, it doesn't matter so much. There are things I'm grateful to them for. There are ways of approaching learning that I'm grateful to them for, and then there are things that I will probably really struggle with and be angry with them about. But the education is one of those things, I think maybe because it's okay now, that it doesn't matter to me. I don't, I got a PhD, it's fine.
But on the
I'm over it.
What was the genesis of deciding to write this book? Were you
Oh, there's things I'm not over.
I feel like so your folks are doing quite well with their business now. There were all of these horrific injuries that didn't receive sort of conventional medical treatment, and still, something about your family. You guys are built to last, it seems. But those successes, that just like they can claim credit for the success of your academic achievements, that they survived these injuries is a validation of their own worldview, which to outsiders seems kind of a little crazy to not go to the doctor, and that their business success is a sort of validation of the choices that they've made in their life, that they were, in their worldview, they're right, that God has provided for them. But the thing that I'm wondering is, it struck me that there was with the prepping for doomsday, there was a kind of, it seemed sort of bound up in insecurity, that when the end times come, that all the people who think they're so great down in town, they won't know what they're doing, and they'll all be the losers, and we'll be the winners. And I guess I'm wondering, and I don't know if you can answer this, just given your sort of detachment from your family, but as the company has taken off and they've achieved financial security, has your dad's sort of paranoia and his fear of the end times and the sort of doomsday focus, has that attenuated at all?
I think it's, as near as I can tell, it's intensified. But
You
I don't.
said he was possibly the best funded survivalist in the American West.
I think that they do invest a great deal more into it than they used to, but they have more money than they used to. So I suspect that there's a relationship between those things. Yeah, I don't think. I think that your point that it has something to do with insecurity seems apt, and I think for some people it's very hard to feel like they'll ever be secure, and it's a difficult thing about life that you never actually are. There actually isn't an amount of money that will make you feel secure, and there isn't an amount of food that will make you feel, there's really, my dad wanted a 10-year supply of food. Like, I have come to feel that if a disaster hits the United States that is so bad that you have to have 10 years of applesauce to get through it, I'm okay just going on the first wave. Like, you can just take, if you need more than 2 years supply of food to get through it, I'm out. Personally, that's my opinion. But for him to feel secure, he needs 10 years of food. Like, whatever. I think though the way I experienced it as a kid was it was a separating force for me. I didn't go to school. I didn't have a lot of friends or really any friends, and when I did finally, I was about 14 or 15 when I got to go over to town and I got to sing in these plays, and I got to actually meet people my own age, which mostly didn't go well. But there was one case, it did start to go kind of well with this guy who was my age, who went to school and was very normal. And it separated me from him in a way, because I was very much living in a world, it was 1999, I thought 2000 was it, that was going to be the end. And I was it was hard for me to even be friends with this person, because I was imagining, well, Y2K is going to hit, and then you're going to want to come steal all of our food. And it was very real in my mind. Like, this was happening, and his family and we were going to be starving. They were going to come try to take our food from us. That's why we needed all these guns, was to defend the people we were going to church with who were going to need our food. It was a very, it separated me from people in a way. It made me skeptical of them in a way that, like, that's what I regret from it. I don't remember the making of the applesauce and the cherries and all that. It was endless, but it wasn't terrible. Mm-hmm. The bad part of it, I think, was the separating from people that now are just, we were related to half the people in that town, It seems a little unfortunate that I was eyeing them with such suspicion.
You have in the book a kind of, it comes across as a really admirable and beautiful trait, but you keep writing hopefully that your parents had changed and there had been some sort of breakthrough. At one point late in the book, you said, Dad, after the accident that nearly killed him, he had changed. He was softer, more prone to laugh. The future could be different from the past. Even the past could be different from the past because my memories could change. His expression, his words seemed to belong to a much older man, a man whose hot blood had cooled, who was at peace. But then a few pages later, he's kind of being a pain in the ass to you, and it doesn't seem like he had changed that much. And similarly, with your mom, there are moments like this, and it made me admire you for the sort of hopefulness and the benefit of the doubt that I think you kept giving them. And I wonder, has that changed? Do you feel like that was making you vulnerable to keep getting sort of wounded by them? Does it affect you in other relationships? I feel like I'm now a shrink here, but you've invited all of this by your book.
I did. So. No, it's all fair. It's all fair. That's a really difficult, important question, and I'm trying to think how to tackle the answer. I don't read the book a whole lot. My own books, that'd be weird. But I read one sentence in it a couple weeks ago because someone asked me a question. I had to look it up, and it was when my dad got burned, and he nearly died. I mean, he got burned because he was trying to take He was trying to crush a car, and he wanted to take the fuel tank off of the car, but he didn't want to drain the fuel out first, because only pansy liberals do that. So he just lit a cutting torch and started removing it, and fuel is flammable. So the car exploded, and he was hurt really, really badly, and he nearly died. And of course, he didn't believe in doctors, hospitals, no pain medication of any kind. He just went through it, and that's a man who believes. That is a man who holds his beliefs it wasn't the case that he just didn't take us to the doctor. He also didn't take himself. And so his heart stopped a couple times. And there was one time that I was there, and I thought that he died. I thought that was it. And I remember I was upset, but it was a lot more than just the loss of my dad. It was like the loss of a whole future life that I had planned for us. And in this future life, we were not fighting, and we were at peace, and we got along, and he'd stopped fighting me for control of my life, and he was happy for me to go to college, and we were at peace. We were a father and daughter at peace. And when I thought he died, I had to let go of that future. And I think what the whole book is about, I realize now, is that I had to let go of that future anyway. Like, that future had to be let go of. Not because he died. He didn't die. But because it wasn't going to happen. And if it does happen, it's not under my control whether that happens. And there's a book I read recently that had a really good line in it where she said, sometimes you have to give up the myth of a good childhood in order to have a good adulthood. And I think, for me, I was so desperate to believe that there was something I could do to make my relationship with my dad work. That if I could be the right kind of person, if I could be good at certain things or talk to him a certain way, or that it was compulsive. I couldn't really stop myself. I believed so deeply that that one day we would have a peaceful relationship. And I think it's strange because now I think we have a super peaceful relationship, but we don't talk. It's like the most peaceful of any relationship.
It's funny how that works.
And so, I can sit here and I can think about my dad, and I can remember nice things about my dad, and I can remember sacrifices he made for us because he made a lot, and I can remember nice things that he did because he did do a lot of nice things. But the war is over. That constant fight is over. And it's not an ideal solution. I would never say to anybody, well, really, everyone should just be estranged from their parents. We have a more peaceful world. Like, that's not my argument. But I do think that for some people, that might be the right answer. And it might be that holding on to the belief that something you can do will change another person is toxic for you. And what you have to accept is, this is outside of my power. I do not have control over this person. And I can love them. But love is a weird thing, Love is not actually about power. Love isn't usually about changing people. If you need someone to change in order to love them, you don't love them. You have something else going on. And what I say about my family is, I don't need them to change to love them, but I do need them to change to have them in my life. And I love them either way. The love is for granted. And I used to think that love would fix everything, and that if I loved my family, that meant everything was going to be fine. And now I think love is just love, actually. And maybe the best way to respect love is to respect its limits. And respect that it doesn't give you power over other people, because love is fundamentally not about power.
I've heard you... there we go. We should... I've heard you at times sort of, you've been careful to separate your family from the rest of the Mormon community and say that please don't view them as representative. But I'm wondering, and I truly don't know much about the Mormon concept of foreordination or predestination, but I guess I'm wondering what you make of free will. Was this just a fluke that you got out and your sister didn't? Is there a hand at the wheel in your life? Did this just come down to some combination of your own individual grit and some serendipitous relationships? And
oh, easy question. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I always feel like when it comes to your own life, you want to be super. You want to believe in free will, and you want to believe that what you do matters, and you want to have a conviction in that, and that you have control of your own life. I think you kind of need to believe that in order to get anything done and be motivated to do anything. But when it comes to other people, I feel like you just want to be as generous and understanding as possible about what the limitations are and what structurally is in place that makes their life different from your life. And so I don't know. I mean, looking at my own life, I feel like I was luckier than my sister in a lot of ways. The biggest difference that comes to my mind is I would say the reason that I maybe got out and she didn't is a totally arbitrary thing, and that is that I could sing. And that's not obvious why that would make a difference, but it did because my dad loved to hear me sing, so he sent me to the community center, so I got to meet people like Charles and worry that he was going to steal our food. And then I got used to this standing in front of people and singing, and there's a certain kind of confidence that comes from that. And I also my dad was a lot less hostile and fought me a lot less about going to college because I said, "Oh, don't worry, Dad. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to be a choir conductor. I'm going to come back. I'm going to conduct the church choir." And my dad was like, "Okay." And that's not what happened. But I went. Even my motivations. I didn't want to go to college. I had no interest in college. I didn't even know what it was until someone said, "Oh, if you go there, they'll teach you how to sing." So I got up every morning before going to the junkyard. I taught myself algebra, which was terrible. It's another thing I don't recommend doing. But it's not an exaggeration to say I taught myself algebra because I like to sing. Like, that's the reason I did it. And that one thing meant that the whole community turned toward me. People treated me like I had a future. My dad gave me a little bit more leeway than he did any of my siblings. And that would end up making a huge difference. And that is a fairly arbitrary fact that I could sing. It's like there was a weird thing that happened that I had that allowed other people to treat me like I was going to go somewhere in my life, and that ended up making a huge difference.
You wrote, there was one really devastating sentence in the book to me that you wrote, "All my life I'd been taught that marriage was God's will, that to refuse it was a kind of sin. I was in defiance of God, and yet I didn't want to be. I wanted children in my own family, but even as I longed for it, I knew I would never have it. I was not capable. I could not be near any man without despising myself." Do you still feel this way?
I can move.
What's that?
I was trying to make a joke,
sorry.
but it really landed flat.
No, I can move. Sorry.
I think that's the worst joke I've ever told.
Well, I didn't exactly help you. I'm sorry.
No, I don't really. I don't. I mean, I did a lot of therapy. I was surprised. I remember so clearly what you're describing and feeling that way, and I remember how permanent it felt. It was just this feeling of permanent brokenness. I just thought, this will be with me always, and it's not. I don't understand why it's not. I just know it's not. And I think sometimes we think what's difficult about having a dysfunctional family or a difficult family, we think that it's childhood. And I would say, oh no, childhood is fine. It's adulthood. Adulthood is difficult if you've had a difficult childhood, because what happens is you learn these patterns, or you acquire certain beliefs about the way the world is, the way men are, the way women are. You acquire them in your family, and then what you do is you go out into the world and you recreate that experience, and you draw those people to you who are similar to the first experiences that you had. And I was really lucky in a way, because the first boyfriend I ever had was Charles, who didn't steal our food, and who was just lovely, just the complete opposite. And then I went to BYU, and I lived with these 4 women who were just the opposite of my family. Of everything that I ever thought I knew of what people were like, they were the complete opposite. And I just continued to have these experiences with people that defied my understanding of what people were like. And I do think that we can change our ideas about things. I do think it's possible to reprogram and realize, oh, not everybody is like this. This was just one experience, and there are other experiences. But at the time I was living those sentences, I felt like it would never change.
Well, and I mean, understandably so. I mean, it feels that so many critical points in the book came down to male physicality, that here you are training your mind in the finest institutions on the planet and debating philosophy and expanding your mind, and it all evaporates when you're dealing with a bully. this isn't headed into a question other than just I'm really sorry that you had to go through all of that. But
You know, I mean, it's just people talk a lot about the role that men play in the book, and I was looking over the study guide that they were making for high school teachers, if anyone was going to teach it in high school, which is weird to think about, but you know, good luck. Anyway, so they said, oh, you look over this guide that we drew up, and one of them was a question about toxic masculinity and the role that men play in the book, and aren't they all really terrible? And you know, there's some scenes in there that I was like, yeah, it's kind of hard to argue with the premise of the question. But I also thought, wait, where's the other half of that question? Which is, I grew up in a very male-dominated society in general, and in a lot of cases that was very bad. But there were also some men who played an incredibly important role in my life for the positive. You know, so yes, there was a Sean, but there was also a Tyler. And yes, there was my father, but there was also these professors at BYU, or this Mormon bishop at BYU who I was going to drop out of school because I needed a root canal and I didn't have the money. And he said, let me give you the church's money. And I said no, because I had what a lot of, I think, people who've been through difficult or traumatic experiences, you become hyper independent, and accepting help is really painful. And so I couldn't take any money from the church, and he tried to write me a check from his own personal bank account. And this is think of it, a Mormon bishop, pretty conservative guy, mostly, for the most part, believes that women don't need to work, that they should be at home, and yet, saw me as a person and wrote a check from his personal account for, I think it was $1,500, and just handed it over to me and said, I will not allow you to leave school over this. Like, you need to stay in school. And I think, people are incredibly complicated. Even someone that you think you understand because you know everything you need to know about them, Mormon bishop in Utah, I must be conservative, he must not like women, did one of the kindest things for me that anyone in my life has ever done. And he didn't even know me that well. And he just wanted to play a positive role. And so I think, yeah, there are dreadful men in this book, or at least there are people in the book who are behaving dreadfully who are men. But there are also people in the book who are men who are behaving wonderfully. And I hope that when people ask the one question, that they also ask the second question, which is, okay, there are toxic forms of masculinity, but there are also really wonderful forms of it. And it's not the case that just to be a man is to be toxic. There are really positive ways that you can move in that space, even in a patriarchal space. There are really positive ways that you can act and pay attention and really make a huge difference.
I have a 3.5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I was just at a interview at a private school last weekend where they were assessing my son in the other room, and they were they did everything short of like checking out my teeth, and I was in the second read through of your book, and it made me wonder how you feel about the other extreme in America of this mania and neuroses about hypereducation, and where I'm at right now, I guess.
Yeah. What to say about that? I have 1 minute 35 seconds to answer the question about the state of education.
Make it count.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to try to give a good answer. I worry that we're putting a lot of pressure on the education system to solve social and political problems that have nothing to do with education. So the fact that the economy is changing and that there's a huge anxiety about jobs, the fact that inequality is wildly out of control, and we all tend to live in these cities where the rich people live here and the poor people live here, and we're like, there'll be social mobility, that'll be fine. It won't be fine. And so then we're annoyed at the schools because the schools are not able to deliver the American dream. The schools are not able to deliver social mobility that the schools cannot possibly deliver under those circumstances. And the schools cannot solve the problems of automation. They can't solve the problems these are political problems. These are social problems. We have to solve those problems first, and then the schools can be schools. But if you're going to, I think what happens increasingly is that schools become kind of job centers or job training centers, and then everyone is hyper anxious about, it's very hard to conduct, I think, a quality education when you're asking the schools to do all of these things. And I happen to think a lot of the things that we're trying to fix with inequality and with what happens to disadvantaged kids, the ultimate answer is we have to mix up our communities. You cannot put the rich people here and the poor people here and have an American dream. It's not possible. And what it will take to live together as Americans again, the tribalism, the extreme, the fact that there's greater social mobility now in Europe than there is here, all of that, there's just one answer, and that is that you have to live with the people who are different from you economically, different from you politically. There's one answer, and that's the only answer there is. And you can send all the charity money you want, and that's the only real fix, in my view.
Well, thank you so much for being here.